as we are preparing to start the lecture and seeing this wonderful cartoon, may I introduce to you our last lecturer, who will present 2 lectures today and tomorrow. It would be a kind of closing. It would be a closing up of our meetings. Professor Riccardo Bellofiore. Professor Riccardo Bellofiore, who is again with us. I mean, all our lecturers are deep thinkers, deep and profound intellectuals, all in its own way, because you cannot find 2 similar intellectuals. And among them, Professor Bellofiore is also a great mind who, I mean, I personally met him only, I think, a couple of times, but he's one of the most interesting person I've ever met. He started, I mean, our lectures, they are about theory, but also about history. Now, Professor Bellofiore is a history, at least, of European economic thought. He started his involvement to political movements, 60s and 70s, and he ended up with professorship at the University of Bergamo, and he always pursued his own way. Someone, I don't know if he liked it or not, someone would describe him as an outlaw, at least in certain circles of intellectual life. I would prefer to call perhaps a maverick, but he always pursued his own way. And this is the way of an intellectual, of a true intellectual. So what we are going to do, we are going to listen to his vision and his approach to some pertinent monetary issues, which will provide us a deeper understanding of European context, Western context, to approach this uneasy and troubled field of monetary economics and monetary policies. Professor Riccardo Bellofiore, please. You should, however, switch on the sound. Riccardo, we cannot hear you.
I'm here again.
Okay, great, great.
Thank you very much for the kind words. I will do my best to disconfirm the good things that you have said. My lectures will be probably up to a point, the one of today more elementary than the one you heard in the days before, even though at the end there will be some personal twist. And the one of tomorrow we will see maybe a bit displaced relatively to what have been said. The title, as you know, is The Reaction to Keynes in Macro. We will see that actually more than Keynes, it will be the reaction to Keynesianism, Monetarism 1 and 2, and beyond. This slide that you see, it's of course a well-known cartoon about Will E. Coyote, Gravity Lessons. It has to do with the fact that I began my university in 71. Yes, I was there in the late 60s, but very, very young. And in 71, I began university, the law faculty, actually. I decided to do economic theory from 73, 74. So I began in a period of a great capitalist crisis, the era of the so-called stagflation. I have been lucky enough to see three great crises. One is the one of the 70s or late 60s, 70s. The second is the so-called Great Recession or Great Financial Crisis, 2007 and after. The third one is the pandemic one. Now, the great capitalist crises are always gravity lessons. I am retired since a couple of years. I have been teaching at the University of Bergamo. There I was lucky enough to meet Hyman Minsky in the late 70s. So I would like to quote Minsky at the beginning. It is a quote on 1985. It was a comment to Pierangelo Garegnani. It was not a nice comment, actually. He ended this comment with this ironic but meaningful phrase. He wrote, another great American philosopher, Vincent Lombardi, who, like George Allen, was a successful football coach, once said, winning isn't everything, it is the only thing. I would like to paraphrase this sage and make the radical statement that for an analysis of capitalist economies, money isn't everything, it is the only thing. Now, of course, if you take this perspective, all the distinctions about real and monetary becomes very, very complicated. So in what I will say, you will find more real stuff than the monetary stuff treated by the three speakers before me. The main point of my talk will be monetarism. Monetarism is an ambiguous concept. It is related, of course, to Milton Friedman as the Pope. The true starting point of my story will be the 1967 lecture, the presidential address at the American Economic Association, which was published the year after, 1968. Of course, Friedman had a story before this presidential address as the author who tried to revive the quantity theory, who had a peculiar theory of the consumption function, and who had a peculiar methodological approach. Friedman and monetarism are probably the main responsible theoretically of the late 70s U-turn in economic policy. The one who is taken to be, the U-turn who is taken to be the beginning of the so-called neoliberalism. Monetarism has been seen as the first great success in the reaction against Keynesianism, arguing for money neutrality in the long run and the ineffectiveness of the policy in the long run. I will trace somehow this story going from monetarism of Friedman, monetarism 1, to the new consensus of the early 2000s. Monetarism, however, at the beginning especially, began a kind of all-embracing term. There was a very loose utilization. Everybody who was stressing a relevant role of money. The funny thing is that monetarism, as I said before, is neutralizing money, but those who said that the money was not neutral were called monetarists. So, for example, I was part of a left group in the 70s who stressed exactly that, the role of money in capitalist restructuring. They were called by the other comrades as the monetarists. An interpreter of Marx, Hans-Georg Backhaus, stressed that Marx was a monetary labor theory, a monetary value theory, and it has been called monetarist. Monetarism has also become, for many in this loose talk, the way to define neoliberalism. What is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism very often is interpreted as the application of monetarism. Now, before going to my main story, I thought it would be better to do what in the past could have been called a sort of declaration of faith. I will say these things without arguing about them. Some of them will return tomorrow, but I think that in economic theory, we have to distinguish, following Schumpeter, what is called monetary analysis versus the real analysis. Real analysis are those analyses who began analyzing the economic system from the real magnitudes without introducing at first in the core of the reasoning money. Monetary analysis is the opposite. Monetary analysis is an analysis of economic realities which put money at the ground floor, at the even below the ground floor, at the beginning of the reasoning. So I am for a monetary analysis. I am in favor of a credit theory of money, that is, money must be explained on the basis of credit and not the other way around. I am in favor not of the micro foundations of macroeconomics, but of a macro social foundation of individual behavior. I have been working a lot in the so-called circuitist tradition, more on that tomorrow. As Anna Carabelli said some days before in the chat, the circuitist tradition goes back to Keynes' treatise of money in the 30s and Schumpeter's theory of credit in his book Theory of Economic Development. But in fact, I would go back to Wicksel's interest and prices. I would give an interpretation of Wicksel's interest and prices a bit different than the one given by Noemi Levy. That is, Wicksel's is a theory of the bank firm monetary circuit, which is very much independent and contrary to the Austrian Mises Hayek development. So this is my background. My background is between monetary circuitism and financial Keynesianism. Monetary circuitism I take in the Italian version, which is the one of Graziani. More on that tomorrow. Financial Keynesianism is for me synonym of Minsky, essentially. If you want to go back to the real source of all these lines, paradoxically enough, the real source is Marx's monetary theory of capitalist production. If you take the expression money in motion, which is very often used by post-Keynesians and other heterodox, money in motion is a good description of what Marx thought to be value in motion. And money in motion and value in motion must be related to the characteristic of capitalist development as an unbalanced process. Now, the paradox is that not only traditional Keynesianism, not only monetarism 1, 2, and beyond until the new consensus, but also very much most of non-traditional Keynesian, non-monetarist traditions, heterodox traditions, have not been very monetary in treating macroeconomics. Jan Kregel spoke of this heterodox analysis as something where there is Hamlet without the prince. Now, it is not possible under my declaration of faith to have a true macro analysis without monetary analysis. So there should be more analysis about that, but I would have some dissent with Sergio Cesaratto. He says the endogeneity of the money supply is a fact. Unfortunately, the facts are complicated because facts exist, but as long as you talk about facts, they are theoretical. So I don't really think that endogeneity of the money supply is what is really accepted. What is really accepted today is the endogeneity of monetary policy. In the wonderful lectures by Toporowski, he stressed very much the endogeneity of monetary policy, starting from a sort of institutional pragmatism. A lot of what he says I accept. At the same time, I would like to understand the institutions are institutions of what. So my point in my declaration of faith is that you have to begin from an analysis of capitalism as an essentially monetary economy before going into the institutional details, not the other way around, starting from the institutions and then going back to the theory. I will have to be very quick, so also the slides will go on very quick. I just anticipate that I don't think that neoliberalism is the same thing as monetarism, and that I don't think that neoliberalism is the alleged return to laissez-faire. At the end of this lecture, I hope to be able to say a couple of words of what I think is the true nature of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, in my view, is a real subsumption of labor to finance. I am twisting some Marxian terminology here, and paradoxically enough, is a financial privatized Keynesianism. It is not the return to laissez-faire. It is a kind of economic policy. So let us go to the core of this lecture. The beginning cannot but be the debate leading to the neoclassical synthesis, the so-called Keynes versus the classics debate. This was the title of a famous article by X. Keynes here stays for the traditional Keynesianism, actually, and the classics are not the classical Smith, Riccardo, etc., but are the neoclassical, and especially Barras. So this is what John Robinson called the bastardization of Keynes. It is not an insult. This neoclassical synthesis comes from the unnatural meeting of Keynes and Barras. The idea is that the micro level is given by the general economic equilibrium, and the macro level is given by Keynesian economic policy. So the basic theory is neoclassical, the economic policy is Keynesian. How you develop that? Because you assume ad hoc some rigidities, and then you arrive to the Keynesian conclusion of an involuntary unemployment equilibrium. Then the question arises, of course, what about in a fully competitive economy where there are not rigidities? You are in a world in which the money supply is exogenous. If there is a price-wage deflation, the real money supply goes up, the rate of interest goes down, and indirect effect, the investment goes up. Yes, but the founding fathers of traditional Keynesianism, X and Hansen, say you may have a liquidity trap at a positive, even relatively relevant rate of interest. Investment may be inelastic to the rate of interest. So in this situation, the involuntary unemployment condition may be an equilibrium. The answer was by Pigou. Pigou showed that with deflation in prices, deflation in wages, there is a rise in wealth, because the rise in the money supply, real money supply, is a rise in wealth, and this has a direct effect on spending, higher consumption. At the end of the story, Patinkin had to concede that the situation of involuntary unemployment was a disequilibrium from the point of view of the general economic equilibrium, and that in a very hypothetical long run, the neoclassicals were right. You could defend the involuntary unemployment equilibrium only with rigid money wages, Modigliani of the early 60s. From this point of view, you may understand why Keynesianism was understood as fiscalist from the point of view of economic policy. Yes, you had to be Keynesian and in favor of fiscal policy because in practice, in reality, you could avoid involuntary unemployment only in this way, but theoretically, there were adjustment mechanisms in the laissez-faire capitalism. What was Keynes? Keynes was the theorist of the crisis, the theorist of the Great Depression. You could have money relevant from the point of view of portfolio choice, Tobin. The debate between Tobin and Friedman was about the elasticity of assets, real and financial, to the rate of interest. The point became the value in the facts about the parameters. Of course, this traditional Keynesianism was implemented by the Phillips curve, which affirmed an inverse relation between the rate of unemployment and wage dynamics, and through Lipsy, inverse relation between the rate of unemployment and price dynamics. This gave way to economic policy menu. The Phillips curve was stable, and stable since a lot of time. Now, the point is that in the early 70s, this consensus broke down, and John Robinson in 1972, in a paper which was very hard against the Keynesians, and the Keynesians were the traditional Keynesians, could declare a second crisis of economics theory. The first crisis was the crisis of the 30s, the one against which Keynes rose and wrote the general theory, and it was a crisis about the inability of laissez-faire capitalism to of the first neoclassical theory, in fact, the inability of neoclassical theory to explain the level of output. The crisis of the late 60s, early 70s, late 60s, early 70s was the crisis of economic theory in explaining the composition of output. Yes, full employment, but John Robinson asked of whom and what for. She wrote, the first crisis arose from the breakdown of a theory which could not account for the level of employment, as I said before. The second crisis arises from a theory that cannot account for the content of the employment. Now, let us enter Friedman. Friedman is from the University of Chicago, where there was Henry Simons. At first monetarist, yes, but he was very much in favor of distributive reforms in capitalism. Von Hayek, who was a much more radical but more philosophical in this period, the defendant of the laissez-faire. Lange was a Marxist, even though an admirer of the general economic equilibrium. Minsky studied in the Chicago just before World War II, and it is interesting to read the very fond memories of Minsky about his beginnings in Chicago, how it was good to learn economic theory in Chicago in a place where economics was seen as a part of social science, not a technique. It's very paradoxical seen from now. Friedman, as I told you before, here I skip very much most of this slide, as an interpretation, a new restatement of the quantity theory, a new theory of the consumption function, and this is interesting for what follows, as in a model which from the point of view, a method that from the point of view of what we will say is very interesting, a method which is instrumentalist. What does it mean? That he thinks that from the point of view of method, a model is good as long as it works. His economic policy is follow a fixed rule, not discretion. Now, here there is his great lecture of 1967. It was a lecture against the Phillips curve, but the strange thing is that the Phillips curve at the time when Friedman attacked it was still working and working quite well. So from the point of view of method that Friedman defended, it was not very reasonable to attack it. But Friedman didn't follow his own method. He went to question the logic of the Phillips curve, and rightly so. He said that the Phillips curve disregards agent expectations. You have to introduce in the Phillips curve expectations. He introduced the adaptive expectations. The background is an analysis, neoclassical analysis with frictions of the labor market, which is able to reach a stable unemployment equilibrium, which is called natural, and why you have to go against nature. In this world, the bargaining for wages is for money wages, but the bargaining is for money wages from the point of view of workers who want some expected real wages, expected according to adaptive expectation. Now, the point is that expansionary Keynesianism, which in the view of Friedman means deficits monetarily financed, expansionary Keynesianism was able to fool workers. How? They saw their money wage going up relatively to past non-inflation or moderate inflation. This meant for them higher real wages. At the same time, the firms see much better and see that the real wages are going down. So firms are demanding more labor. Households are offering more labor. This means to break the full employment barrier, but these errors are corrected in the next few periods because there is a rise in inflationary expectations and the Phillips curve shifts up. There is an acceleration of inflation. Friedman seemingly wins on five grounds. The first is that he was able to explain the success of Keynesianism and the validity of the Phillips curve after World War II. But the success was temporary and the validity was only apparent. Second, he was able to give a conservative account of the coming instability of the United States and of advanced capitalism, an instability which began actually in the mid-60s and became blatant in the early 70s. There has been the Vietnam War, the Johnson War on poverty, actually the beginning of moderate government deficits in the US, a quite substantial amount of increase of liquidity. This led to the collapse of the system of Bretton Woods. In the background, intercapitalist rivalries. Now, it is important to understand that Friedman was able to say that something was going to be wrong before this appeared as a reality, as a fact for everybody. The same is true for the Phillips curve. Friedman was able to see beforehand that the Phillips curve was stable for a while, would have become unstable. Of course, this was going on also with strikes and struggles on the wage and the productivity from the point of workers. Later, there were the oil crisis. The point is that Friedman had his own monetarist way to understand this. This means that, again, beforehand, Friedman was able to picture a situation of stagflation, that is, inflation, rising prices, a slowing of capitalist accumulation, rise of income, and so on, and increasing unemployment. The combination of rising prices and increasing unemployment was a new fact, and there was a way to understand it proposed by Friedman pretty early. The 5 target that Friedman was able to get was to answer a question that probably you in Russia have already heard. What is to be done to eradicate inflationary expectations? And how you can eradicate inflationary expectations? Inducing deflation in the system. Now, in the 70s, the monetarists and even the followers of monetarism were winning in the academia. At the end of the 70s, they were able to produce, or they went along with the affirmation in reality of a U-turn in economic policy. With Volcker, Volcker was appointed by Carter, a Democratic president, but in a situation in which there were fear for rampant inflation also in the US, then Thatcher, Reagan, and so on. This followed the Keynesian economic policy disaster. In the years before, in many countries, there was the attempt to fight rising unemployment, mistaking a cost inflation for what was an effective demand failure. Thatcher-Reagan meant a violent surge in rate of interest, went up nominal, but also real, up to 4 or 5%. Thatcher-Reagan meant a violent attack against trade unions, so higher unemployment, reduction of wages from nominal to real, not only the share. There was the alleged will to reduce the government deficits. Actually, government deficit was controlled if you look at social expenditure, but the strategy misfired in the sense that there was in the 80s, as we all know, an explosion of the interest part of the government expenditure. But even this misfire was functional to this monetarist view, because the catchword became kill the beast. The beast was the state intervention in the economy, and as long as the government deficit and then the debt went up and up, this meant that also the future governments, maybe democratic, maybe progressive, had to fight the deficits. These deficits were not deficits that the governments wanted to create to practice some good use value production. These deficits were created by the vicious cycle of deflation. So they were what a French circuitist, Alain Pargues, called not good deficits, but bad deficits. No. Then we come to monetarism Mark II. Already in the 70s, there was a radicalization of the ideas of Friedman, Lucas and others. The funny thing is that the first paper in which these rational expectations were proposed was by Lucas with Rapping, late 60s, but Rapping became a very radical and Marxist economist. Somehow, I don't know why, Lucas took the Nobel Prize. Rapping didn't take the Nobel Prize. However, the point is that Monetarism Mark II is a misnomer, probably, because you can read Lucas as an internal criticism of Friedman. The base is told to be a rigorous micro foundation. You need to have a macro which is rigorously founded in Varadian general economic equilibrium. The scholars of the intertemporal general economic equilibrium like De Broo and Hahn were saying that actually you can probably demonstrate the existence of general economic equilibrium, but not the unicity nor the stability. There may be an argument that neoclassical general economic equilibrium was much more destroyed by this kind of scholars. There is a famous theorem of Sonnenstein, Mantel, and De Broo, showing that there is no stability of general economic equilibrium. These scholars showed that in the general economic equilibrium, there is no room for essential role of money. So it seems it's problematic to take without mediations that as the basis of macro. However, this is what they do. They say rational behavior requires rational expectations. Adaptive expectations allows for systematic errors, and this cannot be accepted. Agents must use the totality of the information set, including the good theories of the economist, and absorbing the monetary policy rules. If you go along this way, you say that there is an error, I think, there. Monetarism, it is an error. Monetarism 1 said there was a monetary non-neutrality in the short run. Monetarism 2 says that there is monetary neutrality already in the short run. Monetarism 1 said that yes, policy is not effective in the long run, but it is effective in the short run. Monetarism 2, that is Lucas, says no, the policy effectiveness, that's all wrong. Policy effectiveness is not there even in the short run. Maybe that the most important thing of Monetarism 2 was not the theory, but the influence of monetary policy. The Monetarism 2, Lucas said that non-systematic monetary policy may induce errors, stochastic errors. So yes, the barrier to full employment may be surpassed again, but this means to introduce chaos in the economy. So this is not a rehabilitation of Keynesianism, of discretional Keynesian economic policies. It means another thing altogether. It means that central bank policy must be pursued, not ex post, fighting inflationary expectations, but ex ante, manipulating the expectations through credible monetary policy. This means that if you gain credibility, deflation is not so cruel as it may appear if you start from Friedman. This was, in fact, nothing but a class struggle from above, utilizing a phrase of the Prime Minister Draghi. It was a way to demonize the drama of ideological conflicts. Every struggle of workers is always seen as ideological conflict. I have taken a lot of time, so I want to be quite quick on this. The remaining story is real business cycles. and not new consensus. Okay, new consensus, yeah. Real business cycles. Real business cycles introduce a sort of endogeneity of the money supply, where it is taken from a very crude reading of Wicksell, which is not the one I told you before, the one of the monetary heterodoxy, not even the one of the Austrian. It is a very crude idea that banks will just supply whatever money it is needed at a given monetary rate of interest. And it is an endogeneity of monetary policy. It is a targeting of the interest rate. At the same time, there was an endogenous technical progress theory. Here again, they go to some non-strictly orthodox thinkers like Smith and Schumpeter. So after having winning with Monetarism I and Monetarism II, the idea is to include in their own model some sort of bastard endogeneity of the money supply and some simplified endogeneity of technical progress. The substance is to go back from demand to supply dominance. It is the supply which dominates, not the effective demand. What is the opposition? The opposition could be seen in the new Keynesian macroeconomics. Now, the new Keynesian macroeconomics start from the same point of Lucas, in a sense, Varrogian general economic equilibrium, but in a way which is more compatible with this, with scholars like Anne and Debro, etc. The idea is that Varrogian general economic equilibrium is a system where there are complete spot and forward markets, and there are no asymmetries. Now, if this is a good starting point, they say, to analyze real economies, if you begin to introduce asymmetries, if you introduce imperfections. The most interesting lines do that, analyzing through principal agents models what is going on in labor markets and in credit markets. So firms versus workers, banks versus firms, and so on. You are able to introduce price and quantity constraints, create rationing, even rigidity of the wages, of the real wages, and you are able to get to involuntary unemployment equilibria. You recognize market failures, you have a place for policy activism. The problem is where? The problem is that there is no Keynes in new Keynesian macroeconomics. The fault of unemployment, if you read them seriously, is not due to effective demand failures on the commodity market, as in Keynes. The problem is rather labor supply, workers, if you wish, who puts rigidities, real rigidities in the system, or finance, rigidities or imperfections from the point of view of the credit supply. If you are rigorous and go to the economic policy, the right economic policy starting from here is what I would call social liberalism. That is, yes, markets are imperfects. You have to reduce the imperfections and making markets the nearer as possible to free market general economic equilibrium. This is the liberal side. You can add corrections, social corrections to this reality. If you look at the moderate left policies in France, Italy, somehow partially Clinton and so on, you are in this world, social liberalism. The new consensus ruling at the beginning of the 2000s was, in fact, a fake synthesis among the extremes, new classical macroeconomics and new Keynesian macroeconomics. It is the new form of the neoclassical synthesis. It is the so-called three equations model. You don't have anymore the LM, but you have money, a line showing that money is provided according to some policy rule, given rate of interest, the Taylor rule. You have the line. You have an IS, but the IS has that form because the consumption function is shown to be dependent from the interest rate. So Friedman again is looming in the distance, and the Phillips curve is has that form because of the short run rigidity of the nominal wage. Now let me go in what are, I think, the last 15, 17 minutes to what I would define in an Hemingwayan way the short, happy life of Milton Friedman. Can we frame all these under the label monetarism? I don't think so. I think that monetarism, strictly speaking, as an experiment in economic policy, was born in '79 with Volcker and died in 1982, no more than 3 years. The dead was certified by the Latin America debt crisis. Latin America was in huge debt. They were indebted against the US banking system because of the low rate of interest in the 70s. But when there is a situation like this, who is in trouble more than the borrowers are the lenders, and the lenders were US banks. At the same time, there was a lot spread of bankruptcy in commercial banking in the same period. So the second Reagan was very much different from the first Reagan. The real question here should be why it did not happen again. You remember that it was a title of a collection of articles by Hyman Minsky. Can it happen again? It is a great crash like in 1929, 1930s. People like to remind that book saying that, yes, the answer of Minsky was yes. No, the answer of Minsky was no. It very likely will not happen again. And I think still now that he was right. There will be counter tendencies. The first counter tendencies was the second Reagan, what Krugman has called weaponized Keynesianism, which led to the twin deficits in the US. But the real birth of neoliberalism, as we have known it for 20 years, from 1987 to 2007, is related to Greenspan. Greenspan inaugurated, more or less tentatively, without probably knowing it completely, what I would call a financialized, privatized Keynesianism. The beginning was the stock exchange crisis of '87, the willingness of Greenspan to finance the system so that there was no true collapse. And this ended creating a situation in which the key component of autonomous demand was indebted consumption. And this indebted consumption was policy manipulated, especially from a new monetary policy. That's why I called it privatized Keynesianism. It is a Keynesianism because it is a manipulation and the policy manipulation of effective demand. But it is privatized. The background goes back again to a Minskian notion, money manager capitalism, the introduction of pension funds, institutional funds, and so on. They were actually going into a picture like this. We need to concentrate on three figures, three pillars of neoliberalism. The first is workers' traumatization. The second is that savers are in a manic phase. The third is the origination of indebted consumption. Workers' traumatization, we know what it is. I described it. After Thatcher and Reagan, there was an attack on the labor market and also in factories and labor processes of any kind, so that workers were traumatized. That means that you can't go asking for higher wages or control your work effort, even if there is something near full employment. This has been the reality more and more in the 90s and early 2000s. And why so? Because the full employment is a full employment of casualized workers. But at the same time, a situation where the main agents on the stock exchange are pension funds, institutional funds, and so on, create an appreciation of the past savings, such as savers enter in a kind of manic phase. They think, and in a sense, it's true, they are richer, and they go into debt, hence the indebted consumption. Of course, this is a situation in which we should look very carefully at distributional realities and so on. But what is important to understand is that for the first time in history after the 70s, the subsumption of households and so of most also workers into finance, the finance world of the stock exchange and of debt, well, this was not anymore formal, but it was having real effects. What does it mean, having real effects in a reality like this? It means that the subsumption of workers under finance means that really people work more. Really, more workers, think of also of female workers, etc., have to go to work. Means that the way firms are conducted by the management is dependent from finance. So the real shape of production depends on finance. But this financing mechanism, as I told you, means that the capital asset inflation gives way to a higher effective demand. Effective demand goes up thanks to the consumption, autonomous consumption, which is now divorced from income and dependent of this monetary policy. So there are a lot of real effects. That's why I call this a real subsumption of labor to finance. Finance means stock exchange, but also debt and banking debts. Labor is more general to mean also workers in different distributional moments. Real means these real effects. Somebody has talked of the crisis of 2007, 2008 as a Minsky moment. This because in January 2007, the expression Minsky moment, which was used first almost 10 years before, relatively to the Russian situation by a financier who knew well Minsky, these bloggers, financial bloggers, start looking at the economic situation and were saying, oh, probably there will be a rise of the rate of interest because of private indebtedness. But it is the indebtedness not of the firms, but of the households. That's true, but it was not a moment. It was an half century, and in my interpretation, it was a Marx-Minsky half century. It was a condensation of a situation which was created since the middle of the 70s, at least. I would say that Minsky must not be read fixing him to the canonical model in the book of 1975, where there are well-known problems of going from micro to macro, to the micro willing of individual firms to go into more debt, to a macro more indebtedness of the firm sector. Both Kaleskian authors and circuitist authors have shown that this passage is very problematic. It may be less problematic if you read it in a similar way of how I read the Marxian tendency of the rate of profit to fall. It is a tendency. This tendency is stalled, so to speak. It is suspended by counter tendencies. So there are stabilizing factors, but these stabilizing factors just push forward the moment of the crisis. And the moment of the crisis may happen for whatever reason. The expression by Minsky was something happens. The rate of interest goes up, not necessarily because of the over-indebtedness, and the bubble collapses. And that's at the moment in which the unsustainability of the process shows that the stability of the decades before was simply hide the instability. From this point of view, the Minsky, who is more interesting, is not the Minsky of the 60s and early 70s, but the Minsky of the late 70s and the 80s, the one that I met. The Minsky who took up again Schumpeter's stage theory of capitalist development, that I would integrate with the Marxian stage theory of capitalist development. That is the idea that each phase of capitalism is idiosyncratic. It is always capitalism, but they are different capitalism. Each upswing is due to some mechanism, but this mechanism nurtures the contradictions that will lead to the downfall. There has been a lot of discussion of what was the cause of the Great Recession. Everybody also in these lectures, when speaks of the Great Recession, says, I've never understood why that the Great Recession began in 2008. Probably they think of Lehman Brothers. I think that the Great Recession began in July, August 2007. Yes, I admit, I say this because I wrote a paper on this new great crisis in September 2007. So I have to say that the great crisis was already there. But in fact, I think that probably the real beginning of the crisis was even before, in the crisis of 2000 and 2001. And again, I say this because in an article in Italian, I analyzed the crisis of 2000 and 2001 as it would have been correct to analyze the crisis of 2007, 2008. I think that actually the subprime phenomenon was a way to delay the crisis that already began in 2000, 2001 to 2007 and 2008. The discussion in the literature, usually from the heterodox, can be divided in many ways. For my point of view, it is useful to relate to those Keynesian and Marxist authors who says it was not a financial crisis, because financial crisis is always a phenomenon of surface. It was a real crisis. So you have a lot of authors in the neo-Ricardian tradition or surplus tradition that say that it is due to the low consumption of the masses, but they also may be under-consumptionist Marxist. I don't think that this is right. there was rather a push to over-consumption. Yes, low consumption of the masses is always the last instance cause of the crisis, but the last instance is always there. So it does not explain any crisis. Marxist says, oh no, it is the falling rate of profit tendency that wins. Well, not sure, because after 1980, profits went up and up and up. And you have to manipulate the data to show, in a quite perverse way maybe, to show that this is a falling rate of profit crisis. It was a financial crisis, yes. And in this system of capitalism, the money manager capitalism, the real subsumption of labor to finance phase of capitalism, finance was at the heart of the real means to get surplus value and profits. So in this capitalism, a financial crisis is immediately the crisis of the real mechanism to growth. I think that I can stop here and leave to you the reading of the next 3 slides that more or less repeat what I have already said.
Okay, thank you so much. Somehow your picture disappeared at some point, so we cannot see you now. Please, questions. Murat Bakeev, please. But you should switch on your sound.
I'm sorry, but it says my computer that it has been canceled the video by the organizer. I don't know what that means.
We'll fix it. We'll fix it. Sorry for that if it is so. But
I don't know. Maybe it's on my side. Please speak loud.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, then thank you very much, Professor, for an interesting lecture. You've discussed Volcker's monetarism and Greenspan's neoliberalism or privatized Keynesianism. I would like to know your opinion on the role of academic macroeconomics in these central bank policies. Can we say that there was a weaker or stronger link with some respective academic theories or schools or not? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. What do you prefer, Dennis? That I answer each one?
I think it's better to answer each one.
Partially, I already answered maybe. My idea is that there was a lot of ideology, but up to a point. That is, the traditional Keynesianism failure was due to the fact that they were not able to provide an analysis in which money was already essential, was really essential. So the criticism, the academic criticism of Friedman was deserved. It was paradoxical because it said, looks at money at the same time in which he actually argued that in the long run, money doesn't matter. But when we are talking of neoclassical synthesis and Friedman, we are talking of a world which actually has some contacts with economic policy making, which is not really ideological. After things changes, there is a paper by Menkew. I think it can be easily found online, in which the title is something like are macroeconomists scientists or engineers? And he says they think of themselves as scientists, and the story of the debate in the 70s, 80s, and 90s is going that way. But what they have produced is not really relevant for the actual policy making, which could have been done, and it has been done with a more crude approach. I think this is right, except for the one point that I stressed, that is the passage from a monetary policy intervening after on expectations and a monetary policy willing to act on social agents' expectations beforehand. That has been quite effective, also quite devastating. But if you analyze it outside of their own lenses, it is really something that can be qualified, as I said before, as class struggle from above. It is quite also paradoxical that maybe on economic policy, maybe it was more relevant, the more overtly ideological posture of the Austrians, Hayek, but even more Mises, than monetarists of any kind. If I should give you my own idea of what has been the debate in economic policy, not looking from the point of view of theory, but of the actual economic policies of the period 1987-2007, I would say that the struggle was between two lines. The dominant one was the neoliberal. The alternative one was the social liberal. Yes, of course, there were the fringes, there were the others, but I don't consider them. The real intriguing point is that the neoliberal could refer to Lucas or Mises or whatever. The social liberal could refer to the new Keynesian, etc. But none of them was truly liberal, 100% from the point of view of laissez-faire, or going back to laissez-faire. I give you some examples from the 90s because they are the most clear. Take Berlusconi in Italy and take Bush in the US. They are examples of neoliberals. They are for free market in the labor market. They are against welfare because labor must be a commodity like any other. But they definitely were not for the free market. In the good market, they were actually monopolists or oligopolists and defended that position. And they were not for on the point of view of debt, of public debt, they just didn't care about government deficits. Now go to the social liberal side. Here I am a bit stretching the argument so that the figure is clearer relatively to the actual reality. But take a government like Prodi's government or some government in France and so on. They are the opposite. They are not for the free market on the welfare, because they say that there must be a welfare, even maybe with a basic income, guaranteeing people, not simply workers. At the same time, they don't think that labor is a commodity like any other. So they are not in favor of casualization. They are in favor of flexibility of labor. But you have flexibility of labor, you need to have the support of the universal welfare state that they dream of. But if you go on the good market, and if you go on the government expenditure, they are for the it is the antitrust culture. The market is what regulates capitalism, monopoly, capital, etc. And yes, you have to control the public debt. In Europe, that was pretty clear, the position of many on the left. So none of them was actually for the free market. What is the paradox in the paradox? The paradox in the paradox is that neoliberals won. In the 2000s, everybody was neoliberal, in a sense, more and more, especially, but neoliberalism collapses. So neoliberalism, as I describe it in its poor way, died. But it remained as a zombie. That is, who managed the crisis of neoliberalism? The neoliberals. They are there and so on. And so the funny thing is that you are now in a world which is difficult to define, in which you have bubbles, but not anymore in what seemed a dynamical world, paradoxically, as that neoliberalism was. The picture is complicated or revealed by the fact that we have had two great crises, one after the other, the Great Recession and the pandemic. Everybody now is talking of going back to some sort of new intervention of the state. I'm very worried because from the Italian window, at least, the new intervention of the state is an intervention in which fiscal policy is there again, but the criteria of fiscal policy and the criteria of the state in managing work and the labor condition are quite the same as before, as in the neoliberal era. So it is a very, very strange world.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that perhaps we should introduce a prize to the most active participant, and it should go to Gunnet. Gunnet, please.
I don't see him. Here he is.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi, Prof. It was a good lecture. Thank you very much. Maybe my question is going to press you more on your remarks as we are responding to the question by Murat. I could not get your characterization of the Great Recession. Okay, I hear you where you say it was a financial crisis. But there's an interesting way that Jan Toporowski put forward the other day. He said it was a crisis of falling investments, which had been, and so a crisis of corporations what do you call it, the assets and liabilities, But then he concludes by saying it was a crisis of falling investments, a crisis of investments, as in the traditional Marxist way, but expressing itself differently in the age of finance capital. So I hear you saying under finance capital, your model, labor had been subsumed by finance. But I don't hear you making the distinction between stressing the role of investment in that crisis. I hear you only mentioning finance only. So I would like to hear your position on investment with regards to the Great Recession of 2008, and I guess it still persists even now in this crisis of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. It is a big question. I try to say something. First, a theoretical point. Maybe you have get that in my own way, I refer to Marx. This is also true about the crisis theory in general. And usually you distinguish in Marx a crisis theory for a wage squeeze. I have an element of that. My analysis of the crisis of the late 60s, early 70s is not of wage squeeze, but of squeeze for struggles in productivity and also wages, but I very much stress productivity. So in the 70s, the crisis was not for the falling rate of profit, but it was a crisis of profitability. Then there are a second and third kind of crisis. The distinction is due to Paul Sweezy, disproportionality crisis and underconsumption crisis. Now, it may be questioned if the two should be distinguished. Here, I think, and I have reasons to suspect that Toporowski agrees with me, that the point is that Marx's theory here was not a theory of underconsumption, but a theory of underinvestment. I read Rosa Luxemburg as a theorist not of underconsumption, but of underinvestment. And I think that in the Marxian framework, this should be integrated with disproportionalities. This more or less is a quite accurate explanation of the crisis of the 30s of the last centuries, or let us say, not far off the mark. Then there is the canonical falling rate of profit theory. It is like the first one, the wage squeeze, a crisis of profitability, too low surplus value. The second was too much realizable surplus value. The canonical falling rate of profit was a good explanation of the long recession, that is the crisis of the late 19th century. What kind of crisis is the crisis of the Great Recession? Being a Marxian, I think that all crises are crises of profitability. My peculiar way of reading the long history of crisis in capitalism is to say that the falling rate of profit tendency is always there, but in the 20th century, the counter tendencies were strong enough to beat that tendency. So I would read the crisis of the 30s and the crisis of the 70s as two crises in which the stages of capitalism based on counter tendencies against the falling rate of profit were nurturing their own contradictions that exploded in the effective demand crisis in the 30s, in the social struggles in the 70s. But always there is a profitability crisis, and always the profitability crisis affect investment. You are right that I think that the crisis of the Great Recession was not due mainly to a collapse of investment. It was like the crisis of the 30s of too much potential surplus value to be realized. Yes, but in practice, the realization was provided by this indebted consumption. So you may say, you don't have investment as the cause of the crisis, like Toporowski says, like your argument in the other crisis. But you have to consider that autonomous indebted consumption is an autonomous form of demand. It was policy manipulated, but it was shaping the crisis in the core of capitalism, because of course in my reading of neoliberalism was a reading which was apt to analyze the Anglo-Saxon capitalism. A good objection would be to say, and in the other areas of the world, I would say in the other areas of the world, neo-mercantilism was there. So a Luxembourg-Kaleski model was there, and they were making profits through net exports. My idea is that the Great Recession collapsed because the collapse of finance put in crisis indebted consumption and, of course, immediately investment, because most of what Jan Toporowski says is there. That is, there were these financial equilibria. There was not an indebtedness of the firms, but firms were overcapitalized. And as soon as the Great Recession came in, this overcapitalization became over-debt of the firms. It was not there, but immediately materialized there. There is a question that nobody did, but I think I should do that because it is important if you want to understand the Great Recession. What none of us saw beforehand, even me in my wonderful paper in Manifesto in 2000, or in my presentation in London in 2007 on the Great Recession, the key point of the crisis of finance in activating the Great Recession has to do with the main topic of Adam Tooze's Crushed book. That is the link between US finance, European finance, through also the city of London. Everybody, probably including me, was thinking that the real problem was along the axis of neo-mercantilism, or even more, China, US. That was not true. The way finance collapsed was because finance became more and more worldwide, driving US economic policy and world finance. That system, at a certain point, blew up. I'm not sure that we have a completely satisfying interpretation of that, but for the moment, I would put the core of the interpretation on finance as the driver of real growth through indebted consumption.
Well, I think it's a good way to stop, leaving some intrigue or suspense, as someone would say, in order to lead us to the second lecture of yours. We have one more question at least, but as we are online, we should cherish the time of our audience more. So let us stop at this again intriguing moment. Mm-hmm. And let us hope that we will have some clues to understanding what is happening here in our world tomorrow.
If people want the slides and they have not seen that, you can.
Yes, we'll do this. Thank you very much, Professor Bellofiore, and see you tomorrow.
Thanks to all of you also for inviting me.
Same time, same place.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you.
Bye.